The warm light of the old lamps, the smell of dusty pages, and complete silence. This is how my evenings in the library usually end. The clock shows almost 10, and I am finishing my shift. All that's left is to check if the front door is locked before I leave. Suddenly, a sound breaks the silence. The door slams shut. I flinch. It's so quiet here that even the smallest noises seem loud. My heart races, but I try to calm myself. Perhaps one of the regular visitors stayed behind. I turn around and see a young man. Tall, with short dark hair, he looks around uncertainly, as if he's here for the first time. In a moment, I recognize him. It's Michael, my husband's son from his first marriage. I had only seen him in photographs, one where he stood next to Peter in a school uniform, and another where he was already an adult, holding his diploma. I never thought I would meet him like this, unexpectedly in my library. "Good evening," he says, noticing me. His voice is warm with a slight rasp. He sounds confident, but there's something more in his eyes than just simple friendliness. Perhaps a hint of embarrassment. "Hello, Michael," I reply, unsure whether to offer my hand or just smile. He seems both familiar and foreign at the same time. You're closing the library?" He corrects himself. "Yes, almost finished. How did you end up here?" "I decided to drop by. I saw the light and thought it was still open. Then I remembered that you work here. I thought we could get to know each other better." I notice how he approaches the bookshelf, lightly brushing his fingers over the spines of the books. His movements are slow, but his gaze is sharp, as if he's trying to solve some kind of puzzle. He randomly picks up a volume with a dark cover. "Dostoevsky," he says, running his fingers over the title. "Do you like him?" "It's a classic, but I prefer Leo Tolstoy. And you?" Michael smiles. This smile is something special, open yet slightly ironic. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Sometimes I feel like I love books more for how they look than for what's inside." His confession catches me off guard. I laugh, and the tension in the air eases. "Well, that's also a way to love literature," I reply. Over the next few minutes, we talk about books, but I can feel more and more that he's studying me, not just as a person, but as part of his life, which is unfamiliar to him. This feeling is strange, and I start to feel a little uncomfortable. But I don't show it. When the library begins to sink into darkness, Michael thanks me for the conversation and leaves. I walk him to the door, watching him disappear into the evening twilight. Left alone, I suddenly realize that this meeting has left a mark. Vague, yet tangible. Like a book still waiting to be read. The next day, sitting at the table in the teacher's lounge at school, my thoughts keep drifting back to last night. Michael. He seemed so open, yet there was something cautious in his words, as if he was observing me. I wonder, why did he come? Maybe he wanted to spend time with Peter? Or is it more about me? Later, in the evening, I return home from work. Michael is standing at the doorstep. Peter opens the door for him, and they exchange brief greetings. I feel a little awkward. I'm not used to seeing him in our home. But Michael looks as if he's been here for a long time, as if he belongs. "Hi again," he says, nodding in my direction. His gaze is warm, but again, there's something unsaid in it. "Hello," I reply, trying to appear calm. "How was your day?" "Not bad," he says. "Decided to stop by. Dad invited me for dinner." Peter doesn't seem to hear us. He's checking something on his phone, clearly absorbed in his own thoughts. This surprises me. Usually he pays more attention to Michael. But today he's restrained, almost indifferent. After dinner, Michael stays in the living room. He randomly picks a book off the shelf, either out of curiosity or just to occupy himself. Humiliated and insulted. Quite a heavy choice, I remark, pointing to the book in his hands. "Well, you said you preferred Tolstoy," he replies with a slight smile. "I decided to go against that. It's kind of my hobby." We both laugh. His confidence in his words and gestures is evident, but there's nothing forced about it. He seems comfortable being the center of attention, and it comes naturally to him. but his smile is genuine, and I feel at ease with him. When I notice how carefully he's examining the shelves and walls, it stirs something strange in me. His gaze seems to go deeper than I'd like, and I can't quite figure out whether I like it or not. "Do you like it here?" I ask. "Very much," he answers. "It's a cozy home. You can tell that people live here, with their hearts." "That sounds interesting. What are you looking for with your eyes?" I can't help myself from asking. Michael laughs and shakes his head. Maybe answers to my questions. This answer leaves me speechless. But before I can say anything, he adds, "You're not at all what I imagined you to be." "And what did you imagine me to be like?" I try not to show my curiosity. "Different." He answers briefly and smiles again. That night, I can't fall asleep for a long time. His words, his looks, his smiles keep resurfacing in my mind. It all seems so simple and ordinary, but at the same time, there's something about him that makes me think. Michael is like an unsolved book, where from the very first page, it's clear that the plot will be anything but simple. The next morning, Peter suggested we meet the three of us for lunch at a cafe. We chose a cozy place with small wooden tables by the window. The air was filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and freshly baked rolls. The sun was breaking through the clouds, and even in January, it was shining brightly enough to create a sense of spring warmth. We sat down at the table, and Michael, as always, was the first to start the conversation. He turned out to be surprisingly talkative despite his outward reserve. It was as if he knew how to be the center of attention, but managed not to appear intrusive. "So, how about you, Mom?" he asked me, sitting down in the chair across from me. "How was your day?" "Same as usual," I reply, feeling a little embarrassed by his attention. "School, work, the kids, homework." Michael nods, but his gaze doesn't leave me, as if he's trying to figure out who I really am. He shifts the conversation to a lighter topic. "We had a philosophy exam at university recently. The professor asked tough questions, and one guy even tried to get out of it by saying he wasn't prepared at all. Honestly, it was funny watching him make excuses." I laugh, imagining the scene. Michael talks about student life with such sincerity that I feel at ease. He brings it to life, painting a vivid picture of funny and touching details. Of professors who could be characters in novels, of difficult exams where he struggled to keep his nerves intact, of how amusing it is to argue with classmates who can't solve basic problems. Peter silently raises his cup to his lips, and I notice that he barely participates in the conversation. Normally, Peter was full of stories, but today he seems withdrawn. This surprises me. I'm used to him always being open to conversation, always ready to engage in any discussion. But today, his attention is somewhere else. He occasionally throws in short phrases, sometimes absent-mindedly teasing Michael, but there's none of the usual energy in his words. "Don't you want to share how your day went?" I ask Peter, trying to bring him back into the conversation. Peter briefly replies that everything was fine. I feel the conversation slipping into the background again. Michael, however, seems not to notice and continues sharing details of his university life. But now there's something more in his words than just stories about funny situations. There's a spark in his eyes, a thirst for something more. Not just from me, but from life as a whole. His attention doesn't leave my comfort zone, and suddenly I realize that it's easy to talk to him. He doesn't make me fear saying the wrong thing. Instead, everything he says pushes me to reflect on my life, on what's missing. "You study philosophy, right?" I ask. Michael nods. "Yeah, but sometimes I feel like philosophy is too heavy. You start asking questions that don't have answers." He says this with such a serious expression that it almost scares me. All these unanswerable questions feel so foreign to my everyday life that a strange feeling overwhelms me. I realize he's trying to tell me something, but I don't understand what exactly. "You know, I've always thought that the most important thing is to find what truly matters to you. All these questions, they sort of distract you," I remark. Michael smiles and his gaze softens. "You're probably right. Sometimes the answers aren't what we need. Maybe we ourselves are the answer. I smile in return, although something in his words stays with me, not letting go. At dinner, I suddenly feel as though I'm becoming part of something larger than just a family gathering. There's something profound in this conversation with Michael, something that touches me on a level I hadn't considered before. And then I realized that that conversation with Michael, which had seemed so easy and casual, was the beginning of something that I can't fully comprehend yet, but which has already started to change the way I look at life. After lunch, Michael suggested we take a walk along the promenade. A place I had always considered especially quiet and secluded now felt different when he proposed we spend time together. Peter, as usual, preferred to stay at home. He said he wanted to rest a bit. I thought maybe that was for the best. Sometimes I need to be alone with Michael to sort out my feelings and not let them spill out. We stepped onto the promenade, and I immediately felt the evening air fill with a light chill. But next to Michael, it felt warm, as if his presence was heating the space between us. We walked in silence for a while, listening to our steps echoing in the stillness, with only the soft rustling of waves and the shrill calls of seagulls breaking the quiet. "Do you come here often?" he asked, unexpectedly breaking the silence. "Sometimes," I replied, glancing at the familiar landscape. "When I need to be alone with my thoughts. It's peaceful here." "I like it," he said. "It's a simple place, but there's something special about it." "How long have you known Dad?" he asked out of the blue. I was a little taken aback, but answered, not really sure why this question affected me so much. "We met a few years ago, when I first moved here. Peter was always busy, but we quickly found common ground. You know, he's the kind of person it's easy to talk to. But—" I paused, trying to find the right words. "Lately, he's become a little more closed off. I don't know what's going on with him." Michael nodded, and a faint shadow of understanding passed over his face. "Maybe it's just age," he said. "Dad has always been a bit reserved. I remember when we went to the dacha when I was a kid, he wouldn't talk to me for days. But then, when I got older, it became easier. We started talking more, even without words." I looked at him, trying to understand what lay behind his words. He didn't seem upset with Peter. Rather, his words felt like observations, as if he were trying to comprehend how all of this works. "You didn't talk to him very often?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation to a lighter note. Michael fell quiet for a moment, then sighed. "I don't know. We talk, I guess, but not as much as I'd like. It's hard to explain. Sometimes he feels too distant." I nodded, though I lacked the words to express what I felt. I realized Michael was searching for something deeper, something he couldn't find in his relationship with Peter. We continued walking along the promenade, and at that moment I understood that we weren't just talking about family. We were talking about life, about finding our place, about what matters most, about how to find our way without losing ourselves. And the more I spoke with him, the easier it became to express things that were once hard to put into words. "Have you ever thought about who you want to be?" I asked, sensing that this conversation would be significant. Michael slowly turned his head, his gaze soft and serious. "Yes, sometimes I think I'll be a philosopher, and other times I want to be a writer, or maybe a scientist. Everything changes, but I think the main thing is to understand who you really are. And in that search, the process itself is more important than the result." I laughed because his words were both serious and simple at the same time. It's true. It's important to understand who you are. But it's so hard to be certain about your path. "It seems like we have similar views," I said, smiling. Michael smiled back. We walked along the shore, and it felt as though each step brought us closer to something new, something that was just beginning, and that we couldn't predict. And though the promenade remained the same familiar place, it had now become something more. That moment when Michael and I spoke openly, honestly, without hidden motives, felt significant. I can't say exactly how this will change my life, but I know one thing. It's no longer just a walk. It's a step into a new understanding of myself. A few days later, I found a book with a bookmark and a note on the kitchen table. I think you'll like this. Michael. It was a novel I had wanted to read for a long time, but somehow never got around to. I felt grateful, but something about this gesture made me feel a little uncomfortable. The gift was simple, but there was something personal about it. I didn't know how to properly interpret it. After all, I barely knew Michael, and yet he had already given me something related to my interests. Mixed emotions overwhelmed me. He was kind, attentive, but this gesture left a mark. I gratefully placed the book on the shelf, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After work, I decided to stop by the local gym. He was standing by the window, stretching his legs after warming up. When I approached, he didn't notice me right away. His attention was absorbed in his own thoughts. I greeted him and he turned around. "Oh, it's you," Michael said, a little surprised but with a slight smile. "Been here long?" "No, I just got here. How did you end up here?" I asked, trying not to sound too cautious. "I decided to stretch a bit," he replied, continuing to stretch. "I come here sometimes when I can't sit still at home. It's not too intense, but it helps me relax." I nodded, and as I saw him looking at me closely, I almost tripped over a machine and added, "Do you train here often?" "Sometimes. It's a way to escape my thoughts," he said, but his eyes became briefly thoughtful. Suddenly, I realized that our conversations always seemed to flow easily, but there was something heavy, unclear, hidden in Michael's words this time. We began talking about workouts, about which exercises help relieve stress, and he laughed, joking about my choice of machines. His jokes were light, but at some point I noticed that I had a strange desire for him to keep talking. It was comfortable and interesting, but there was a subtle tension in his words. As I ran on the treadmill, my thoughts became tangled. Why did it matter so much what he thought of me? Why was I so concerned that he was evaluating my choice of machine? I couldn't answer myself. The conversation kept going, but I started to feel that some part of my life was suddenly open to doubt. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it quickly," Michael said when he noticed I was too focused on my running. "The key is not to set too high expectations for yourself. Take it step by step." I nodded and turned back to the machine, trying to focus on how I felt. At that moment, I sensed him looking at me again, and I felt that strange mix of comfort and light unease. It was as if I was on the edge of understanding something important, but I couldn't quite grasp it. When the workout ended, Michael came over again and said, "Good luck. See you." I replied, but my thoughts, as before, remained suspended. A week later, Peter, Michael, and I went to a party organized by family friends. It was one of those events where you don't really feel like going, but you understand that you can't refuse. We arrived a little late, as usual, and the door greeted us with laughter and music, immediately immersing us in an atmosphere of ease. Michael entered first, as if he already knew what to do, and immediately attracted the attention of the guests. His charm was obvious. He interacted easily with people, told stories, and made them laugh. But I noticed that behind his jokes and stories, there was something more. He was clearly trying to present himself in the best light, seeking approval, and there was a slight wariness in his eyes, as if he was watching people's reactions closely. Peter and I stood by the entrance, observing what was happening. I noticed how Michael would sometimes glance at his father, as if checking what he thought. Peter, as always, remained on the sidelines, barely noticing the conversations around him. His calmness was odd, a stark contrast to the usual liveliness with which he would join in discussions at such events. "Look, he's trying to cheer everyone up again," I whispered to Peter, trying to find something amusing in his behavior. Peter just shrugged and quietly replied, "He's always been like that." I couldn't understand why Peter was so distant. I was used to his sociability, and now he seemed detached, as if Michael weren't that important to him. I thought maybe he was tired or just dealing with something internally, but it was strange to see him like this. Meanwhile, Michael kept joking, his face glowing with pleasure whenever someone laughed. He was the center of attention, and I noticed how he tried to do everything so that Peter would notice his success. However, the more he tried, the more dry his father's responses became. It was clear that Peter didn't share his enthusiasm. This surprised me. Peter had always been so supportive, but now something clearly hindered him from opening up. As the party drew to a close, I found myself realizing that all this time, Michael had been seeking approval, but wasn't getting it. And the more I became aware of this, the more I began to understand that there was something between them that they weren't talking about. Between the words, there was more than in the conversations. It was like an invisible barrier that couldn't be ignored. The next day, Michael suggested helping with the repair of the old bookshelf in the living room. I was surprised by his initiative, but agreed. He had always been so energetic and eager to get things done, while Peter had recently been avoiding such tasks, preferring to work in his study. Michael and I started taking apart the shelves, carefully pulling out books that hadn't been touched in a long time. I noticed that his hands moved confidently, as though he had done this before. He carefully unscrewed the old screws, taking his time, double-checking everything. "Do you know how to repair furniture?" I asked, not hiding my surprise. "Yeah, I used to be into it. Dad always did everything himself, so I had to learn," he said, without looking up from his work. His words were calm, but there was a hint of sadness in them. I could sense that something was missing in his responses, as if he was avoiding a direct conversation about his family. At that moment, I realized that Michael wasn't just helping, but trying to find his place in this house, in our lives. "Peter and I used to fix things a lot when I first moved here," I said, trying to ease the atmosphere. Michael glanced at me, then continued working, but I noticed how his face became more serious for a moment. He was trying to concentrate, but there was a look of confusion in his eyes. It was as if he was searching for answers to questions he couldn't ask. When we had taken apart the shelves and started sorting through the parts for the cabinet, he suddenly said, "You know, I thought when I grew up everything would be simpler, but the older I get, the more questions there seem to be." His confession caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't even know how to respond. Michael continued working, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his words weren't just a casual statement. It was his way of talking about something deep, something he couldn't express directly. Peter, as I expected, came only after we had nearly finished the work. He walked past us, not particularly interested in the process. "You did well," he said, barely noticing the result. His voice was calm, but I could sense again that there was none of the lively interest I had expected. Michael nodded silently and quickly left the room, and I stood there, deep in thought. Everything that had happened left me with a strange feeling, as though there was an invisible gap between us that we couldn't seem to cross. On the weekend, Michael suggested spending the day in a nearby town and visiting an art museum. I agreed, though I wasn't sure it would be a good idea. He had often talked about how much he valued art, and I was curious to see how his view of paintings would compare to what I was used to. When we arrived at the museum, there weren't many people, and this created a sense of seclusion. Michael immediately headed towards the paintings depicting simple scenes from everyday life. He stood in front of one of them, studying it intently, and it seemed he didn't notice when I stood next to him. "Look at how the emotions are conveyed," he said, not taking his eyes off the painting. "These people seem to live their own story. Do you see that?" I nodded, but I couldn't fully share his admiration. I felt like I was looking at these paintings differently. Michael was fascinated, while I was more focused on what lay behind the depicted scenes, what the people felt when they created them. It was like a conversation without words, where each was trying to understand the other, but from different perspectives. We wandered through the halls, discussing the paintings, and his words became more personal. "You know, I've always thought that art helps you understand who you really are," he said, standing in front of a canvas depicting a bustling cityscape. "But sometimes I feel like it just opens up more questions than answers." His words made me think. It seemed Michael was looking for not only answers in art, but also a way to understand himself. I couldn't help but notice how much he had changed during our time together. He was becoming more open, but at the same time, there was an inner conflict in his eyes, something he wasn't directly talking about. When we stepped outside, Michael easily shifted to more personal topics. He told me about his plans for the future, about how he saw his life in a few years. There was confidence in his words, but I felt that under that confidence, there was a desire for something more, something that hadn't come true yet. I thought I could find myself in science, philosophy, literature, but now everything seems much more complicated, he said, looking into the distance. I need to understand what really matters to me. I remained silent, watching him. Sometimes it seemed like our thoughts were running along parallel paths, but they never quite intersected. Michael was searching for answers in art, and I, in talking to him. It was a strange feeling, to know that there was something important between us, but not know how to express it properly. That day, the museum became something more than just a place for a walk. It became a point where we could be ourselves, without pretending. And despite all the questions that remained, I felt that this day had left an important mark on my life. In the morning, while I was preparing breakfast, Michael came up to me and shared some news that immediately made me feel uneasy. I'm leaving earlier than I planned. I'm heading back to university, he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. I froze in place. Why so soon? Why so abruptly? I hadn't expected this. He had spent a few days here, and although we hadn't talked about anything important, I had felt that his presence had become part of my everyday life. He was here, with us, and suddenly he was leaving, as if it had all been a random episode. Peter, without taking his eyes off his tablet, shrugged. It's probably for the best, he said, not meeting Michael's gaze. I couldn't understand what he meant. It didn't sound like Peter's usual response. His words came out almost detached, as if he had already decided that this was the easier way. Michael remained silent, his eyes never leaving his coffee cup. I could feel that he was thinking something, but wasn't ready to say it. There was something strange in his eyes, as if he couldn't express his emotions or, on the contrary, wanted to hide them. I suddenly realized that this might be a farewell, but not to us. To something bigger. To himself, to what he had been trying to find here. Are you sure? I asked, not knowing what else to add. He looked at me, and for a moment, something warm and slightly sad flickered in his eyes. Yes, I just need to go back. There are things I need to finish. Thank you for everything you've done for me. He stood up, gathered his things, and walked to the door. I stood there, not knowing what to say. At one point, I wanted to stop him, say that I would miss him, that he could stay, but I held back. I couldn't explain why this moment felt so heavy, as if we had just passed by something important and didn't quite realize what it was. Michael turned at the door, glancing at me one last time. It was nice spending time with you, he said and left, leaving me with questions I couldn't find the answers to. After the door closed, I felt the emptiness settle in the house. Peter continued with his tasks, as usual, but I felt uneasy. I stood in silence, feeling how Michael's departure had left a void that was hard to fill with words. I don't know why, but this moment felt important, even though he hadn't spoken his feelings aloud. I smiled in response to his words, even though deep down I felt a slight sadness. Everything that had happened seemed like an episode, yet it had left a mark on my life. Michael had left, but he had left behind many unfinished thoughts that I would likely never let go of. Several weeks later, when I had almost calmed down and returned to the usual rhythm of life, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was unusual, as I had almost forgotten that Michael had left me his address, and I hadn't expected to hear from him. Inside the envelope was a card with a note of thanks for the warm welcome and a short message written in his handwriting. Sometimes the most important thing is simply understanding who we really are. Thank you for helping me with that. As I read these words, I felt a light sadness. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no deep confessions, just a simple but sincere expression of gratitude. It was like a quiet message that leaves a mark but doesn't seek a response. I placed the card on the table and spent a few minutes just looking at it. It was a strange feeling. The thought that Michael had left, but at some point he had still found the words to express what he had felt. In this simple note, there was something important that lingered between the lines. Not entirely understandable, but no less meaningful. It became clear to me that his journey was not just about searching for himself, but also about trying to understand how he was connected to the world around him, to us. And despite everything that remained unspoken between us, this letter gave me a sense of closure. Not complete, but still a kind of closure. I felt that there was something in his life now that had changed, and perhaps because of that, he was able to take the next step. I smiled, feeling a light sadness in my chest, but also gratitude. Life went on, and this episode, though small, had left a bright mark in it, one that I would perhaps remember for a long time.